All right, everyone. So the title of this PowerPoint is Themes of Evolution. And what this PowerPoint really is going to try to do is fill in some of the gaps that we would have gone over in class that we would have talked about, and to fill in some misconceptions or correct some misconceptions that I've noticed in your written responses and the homework and the video guides, all of your written responses in any form that I've gotten them. So this is just more of a review type of lecture rather than introducing new material, and it's to just clear up some misconceptions and fill in some gaps. So the first thing is Darwin versus Lamarck. Lamarck basically argued that individuals use certain structures within their lifetime, and those structures that they use the most become more developed, and the structures that they don't use will become less developed and will be lost over time. So say that the example that I have right here is reading, but say that instead we talk about running. If you train to be a marathon runner, that is something that you would do during your lifetime, and you would develop all of the muscles and the endurance and everything else that goes along with that to be a marathon runner. Lamarck would argue that you would pass on those traits to your offspring. What Darwin would argue, and what we now know to be correct, is that you inherit your traits genetically. So you can work your entire life to become a marathon runner, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to pass on those traits to your offspring. You only would if you already had those genes, maybe some genes for distance running to begin with. So we know that traits are passed along genetically. The chromosomal theory of inheritance tells us that. Basically, you have these chromosomes. On the chromosomes are the genes, and you pass on half of your chromosomes every time that you mate, or every time that a sexually reproducing organism mates. Half from the mother, half from the father, come together, produce a new diploid individual. We went over that when we talked about meiosis. So structures that are not used or lost over time, this does happen. So think vestigial organs. However, it happens because of genetics and not because of what Lamarck would argue. And this last point, don't be surprised if you hear something called neo-Lamarckism floating around maybe in college or something like that. Lamarck was mostly wrong in his the way that he explained how things were inherited, but there are some traits that might be inherited in a Lamarckian fashion. Most traits aren't, but there's this really cool new field of genetics called epigenetics that shows that some things that you acquired during your lifetime may actually be passed on to your offspring. But don't worry about it for this class. Really cool field of work. I can point you to some research, some resources if you're interested in that, because it is really interesting. So what Darwin would argue is that evolution occurs by natural selection. And we've gone over natural selection a lot. I'm going to go over it a little bit more. But just realize that natural selection is the most important process. But do remember that we've talked about others. There's sexual selection, there's migration, there's genetic drift. Migration is also known as gene flow. We will. There are others, but we won't discuss them in this class. There's something called kin selection. There's just other ones that we won't talk about. So again, natural selection. I want to go over this just again to fill in some gaps in your guys' written responses. So natural selection, first off, works primarily on individuals, and I say primarily. I emphasize primarily. And that's what I'm going to talk about almost exclusively from here on out. It works on individuals. So it's individuals, and like of a species, you have many, many, many individuals. I'm an individual, you're an individual. We all know what individuals are. Individuals are the ones competing for resources to stay alive. Those resources could be anything in the environment. It could be food availability, light if you're a plant. It could be water. It could be, any type of resource that's out there. We also try to avoid predators, avoid herbivores if you're a plant. We don't want to be eaten by predators we develop immunity to pathogens, which is just a fancy way to say an infectious agent like a bacteria, a fungus, a virus that'll infect you. And then ultimately, the goal of natural selection, or of a goal for an individual to be in their lifetime, I guess you would say, is to reproduce and breed and pass on their genes for the next generation. So it's all working on the individual level. Natural selection selects individuals that are able to pass on their genes. It doesn't work on populations. It doesn't work at the species level. It works on the level of the individual. There are some arguments for different types of selection and where they fall on, whether they select for genes or for the individual or for the population or for the species. But for right now, for this class, we'll just say that it selects for individuals because that's what it does, roughly 95, 98% of the time. So to hit this part again, we talked a little bit about this, but I wanted to lay this out in kind of a more clear fashion. So there are 4 principles of natural selection, and Darwin laid pretty much all this out. First off, all populations have genetic variation. There is innate variation in all populations. No population is absolutely genetically identical. So different individuals have different alleles for any given gene. The environment will put pressures on individuals. Again, those are limited resources, whether it's, any of these that I list. Could also be predators that is a pressure, parasites, disease. All of those are pressures that influence fitness. If you have, we'll get to that. All of those are pressures that influence fitness. Individuals tend to have more offspring than the environment can support. That's kind of key, and that's one that people miss a lot. People forget about a lot. If you think about most sexually reproducing organisms, including humans, they produced more offspring on average than the environment can support. The reason for that is to hedge their bets. Most of the time, especially if they're low on the food chain, they produce a lot of individuals in the hopes that at least some of them will survive predation or disease and pass and reach sexual maturity. If it's, say a carnivore and that, like an apex predator doesn't have any anything preying on it, it still faces a lot of limited resources, and it still wants to hedge its bet by producing, more offspring than the environment can support, just so the best will survive. Talking about whatever it's best at, whatever its adaptations are for, the best will survive and pass on their genes. And that brings us to this 4th one, which is the longest. Because there's more individuals in any population than the environment can support, some will live to reproductive age and some will not. It's kind of sad, but this is where people get the, nature red in tooth and claw and survival of the fittest and all of that stuff, even though those are a bit exaggerated representations. Individuals that are better able to cope with this wide range of environmental challenges tend to have more offspring than individuals that are less suited to the environment. Basically, those that are more fit make more offspring, and they carry along those fit alleles, those alleles that give them higher fitness, those alleles that are well adapted to the environment, to the current environment. The less fit individuals do not pass on their alleles that make them less fit, so those get weeded out over the generations, and over the generations, the allele frequency for the quote unquote good alleles, the ones that make them better adapted for that environment, increase in frequency. All right, so that's natural selection. Again, the 4 principles of natural selection. And finally, natural selection is not random. This is a huge misconception that most people have about natural selection. Most people think that natural selection is random. They think that evolution is random, but it's not. Natural selection is in no way random. In fact, it is very, very, very deliberately directed. And we talked about 3 ways that it could be directed. There's directional selection, where the entire bell curve of a population moves to one side. There's stabilizing selection, where the bell curve kind of gets shrunk in and a higher bell curve but with a smaller area, or disruptive selection, where you basically have a bell curve that gets depressed in the middle and you have kind of two humps. If you want to, if you have to review those, go back to that PowerPoint where we talk about them. But the point of that, of me saying that, is that natural selection is very deliberate in its action. It is not random at all. The random part that people confuse this with is mutations. Mutations are completely random. There is no direction in mutations. There's no way that an organism can decide what mutations it has or what mutations it passes on to its offspring. Like the example that I give here is that, say for 1,000 years there's been plentiful rainfall. None of these plants have been through a drought. So say that there's just random mutations in a couple individuals that allows them to be a little bit more drought tolerant than all of the other plants in this area, or this population, this species in this area. Say that there's a drought. They have no way to predict that there's a drought. They have no way to say that I want this mutation for my offspring to let them survive this drought, but there's a drought. Those individuals that happen to have that random mutation that lets them survive a drought, and that could be in any number of genes, they will survive to reproduce. The other individuals that won't. So after a few droughts and many generations, the entire population will be drought tolerant. It's kind of a simplistic example, but I did want to give one example of that. So the point of that is that mutations are totally random. The mutation is random, but what natural selection does with those random mutations is not random. That is very deliberate. It selects, if we were to personify it, which, it's not a person or whatever, but if we were to personify it, natural selection picks out the ones that are best suited for the environment, the ones that are not die, or they do not live to reproduce, or they don't reproduce. But natural selection is deliberate. It's not at all random. So that's a huge misconception that I wanted to clear up. If this example didn't resonate with you, email me and I can come up with, dozens of examples, or I can actually research, real examples. Okay. I guess this is the final thing. Yeah. Natural selection, final thing. Natural selection works on phenotypes. So there is some debate about this, but overall, the consensus seems to be that natural selection works on phenotypes. Natural selection picks the strongest, the fastest, the plant that can withstand the drought. It works on the phenotype, the big individual or the small individual, depending on what the environment calls for. It's the phenotype that determines the fitness. So the example that I have right here is a slow, clumsy rabbit versus a fast, agile rabbit. Obviously, the slow, clumsy rabbit will be picked off by a predator pretty quickly. The fast, agile rabbit will live to reproductive age because it avoids all the predators, and it will pass on its alleles, its genes that make it fast and agile. So the phenotype is what's selected for, but those individuals that are fit or well adapted, they pass on the genes that code for those fit and well adapted traits, those traits that make them fit and well adapted. So it's kind of counterintuitive. You think that natural selection would select for genes, but it doesn't. It selects for phenotypes. And the phenotype then basically, kind of works backwards and allows the gene to go to the next generation. It's not a great explanation that I just said, but the phenotype is what's selected for. The genes influence the phenotype. So it's the genes that get passed on to the next generation, but it's really the phenotype that's being selected for. All right. Okay. Evolution is a continuum. We're not going to talk about gradualism and punctuated equilibrium in this class. But regardless of which side of that debate you're on, and I'm in the middle, both of those have their legitimate examples. Everyone agrees that evolution is a continuum. So it is an ongoing process. New species typically don't just pop out of existence from their parent species. There's not one species for, this generation, for the parental generation, and then the next generation is a completely new species. That very rarely happens. It does happen in a couple cases, but typically it doesn't happen. The process takes many, many, many generations with a lot of intermediate steps between one species and the next. So because it's a continuum, and if you don't know what a continuum is, just Google the definition of a continuum. Because it's a continuum, there's no black and white point at which one species becomes two. You don't have like, parent tiger species, and then the next generation you have a Bengal tiger and a Siberian tiger. It doesn't work like that. There's a ton of gray area. And in fact, tigers right now, we talked about this in another lecture, they're actually subspecies. They're not even species. They're not fully blown new species. Um, so typically, there is a ton of gray area. There's like tens to thousands of generations where there is intermediates between one species and the next. So there's really no missing link. People always talk about, we got to find the missing link. Like they'll talk about human evolution and we found this fossil. This might be the missing link. Or somebody that doesn't think evolution is real will say, well, where's the missing link? There's like, this species and then there's humans, but where's the intermediate? Every single individual in that, millions of year process is a quote unquote missing link. Every individual that reproduces, like I have written here, is a link in that chain. Only a handful of them will ever be fossilized. I forget what the number is, but it's like 0.5% of any species, or maybe it's 0.05% of any species. Don't quote me on that number at all. But somewhere along that, way less than 1% of all the individuals of any species, of any given species, will fossilize. And even less than that will ever be dug up. So there's no way that we can ever find every single missing link. A search for that is just ludicrous. So when people talk about the missing link, just understand how silly they are. Okay, so continuing on with that, microevolution we talked about briefly. That is small scale evolution over a few generations. And I say a few, but it could be hundreds. It's just small scale evolution. All that it's looking at is changes in allele frequencies. All of those small scale evolution, like little bits and pieces over a huge amount of time, result in large scale changes in groups. That's macroevolution. So if you were to look at like one lineage, we'll talk about horses, I believe on the next slide. We'll talk about horses anyway in a slide or two. If you look at like just, 20 generations of horses, you probably won't find much difference between the great 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 grandpa and the horse that you have in the stable right now, right? There's probably not much difference unless you're specifically looking at one breed that you're trying to breed. There's not going to be a lot of difference, but there might be a little bit. There might be some microevolution going on. If you add that up over millions of years, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of generations, then you can start to see macroevolution happening. You can start to see how horses diverged. You can start to see how horses are related to donkeys, and how horses and donkeys are related to zebras, and how all of those are related to a more ancestral, now extinct horse, etc. All right. So the point here, you can read it, but it's hard for us to think about those geologic timescales. We tend to think on, minutes, hours, years, decades, maybe. You guys probably not so much because you've only been alive for a decade and a half. It's really hard for you to think about, 5,000 generations ago, or 10 million years ago, or 100 million years ago. That is a lot of time. The scale there is just, it's a totally different scale. So if we look at those previous points with horses, when you see the pictures like this, just know that that is a misrepresentation. Yes, this does represent 4 different genera of horses, 4 different species and 4 different genera of horses. It shows how their skulls have changed over time, their legs have changed over time, and their body size has changed over time. But this does not show all of those links in those 50 million years of every generation. In fact, if horses breed when they're 4 years old, and they can have a new, I believe, colt every couple years, then we can basically do some math and estimate that, have a very rough estimation that there's maybe 500,000 generations of horses every million years. Okay. If you look at this scale right here, 50 million years ago, there was the dawn horse, Eohippus, and then now there is the modern horse, Equus, that evolved about 3 million years ago. Between those 47 million years, we can say that there was roughly 250 billion generations of horses or of horse-like animals between the dawn horse and the modern horse. Again, if you just look at, genetic variation from, 5 generations of horses versus 250 billion generations of horses. Sorry, I kept saying billion. That's million. My bad. 250 million generations of horses. Sorry. That's a total. If I was competent enough to edit out stuff in a video, I would totally edit that out. So sorry about that. Million, not billion, 250 million generations. Anyway, 250 million generations of horses. That is a lot of horses. So changes every generation are imperceptible, but after 250 million generations, you can notice some huge changes. All right. This would be a better way to represent a horse family tree. Rather than this type of diagram, this is a little bit more accurate, shows the same thing except the skulls are missing, but this shows all of the different genera of horses as they evolved and went extinct, and our presumed evolutionary relationships. We're going to actually learn how to do diagrams like this next lesson. Okay. Another thing that you guys that cropped up was some confusion about artificial selection and GMOs and natural selection. So those are 3 distinct things. So this came out in one of the quiz questions. So artificial selection is basically selective breeding. And in fact, it's not basically selective breeding, it is selective breeding. So again, artificial selection, we see variation among our domestic crops and animals. We choose which individuals get to breed. So say that I really, really, really like this dog. He has really good traits for whatever I'm looking for. And I really, really like this other dog, male, female. I'm going to breed those 2 together, and I'm not going to breed the rest of my dogs if I was a dog breeder. I mean, bad example, but okay. Say that I'm a farmer. One of my cows produces just a little bit more milk than all the others. I have this really awesome bull who is super healthy and fit. I would breed those 2 together, see what happens, and maybe I wouldn't breed the weakest of my cows because, that would be folly. That would be silly. It's basically evolution directed by human hands. It's natural selection, but instead of nature selecting, it's us as humans that are selecting. We select the most fit in that case. And again, we're selecting phenotypes, which does consequently select the genes. GMOs, though, are totally different. A GMO, it stands for genetically modified organism, and this is something that we do in the laboratory. So artificial selection happens in the fields and in the kennels and in the stables, but GMOs happens in the lab. And to genetically modify an organism, we can either change the DNA sequences of, say, one individual. So we literally go in using laboratory equipment and tools and techniques and procedures. We go in and take a couple cells out of an individual human. We change those cells, and then we change the genes of those cells, and that's GMOs. So I'll give you an example of that. So there is something called immunotherapy when we're dealing with cancer. What we can do is take some of the white blood cells, they're called T cells, from an individual that has a certain type of cancer, and we can reprogram the DNA of those white blood cells to target and kill that cancer. It's a new way of treating cancer, and it is still, all of the wrinkles are being ironed out right now, but it's really exciting. Basically, we take the cells out of that individual, change them, change the DNA in the lab, and culture them and create millions of them and then put them back into the individual. That is one type of GMO. Another type of GMO is when we take genetic information from one species and then we take those genes out, whatever genes we want, we select them, we target them, and we remove them, and we insert them into the DNA, the genome of a different organism, of a different species. So the famous example of that is what Monsanto did. They took they took genes from a bacteria that made it immune to their pesticide Roundup, and they put it in their corn. So they took the gene from a bacterial cell, spliced it out, took that little gene, and then put it into the corn DNA genome. So the corn is therefore resistant to Roundup. So you can spray the entire field with Roundup, kills all of the weeds that are in that field, and it leaves only that genetically modified corn alive. So there is a couple other types of GMOs I'm not going to get into, but these are the two main types. This is not artificial selection. Artificial selection is basically just taking natural variation that occurs anyway within a population and just selecting for the variation that we see. It's basically just natural selection, but by human hands. GMOs is totally just changing the genome, of a species. So, or individuals of a species. So GMOs are made in laboratories. They involve human manipulation of an organism's genes, and you directly manipulate the genes. So I hope that kind of clears that up and gets rid of some of the mystery of GMOs. If you're interested in GMOs, learning more about them, I know that you don't learn a lot in 2 minutes of me talking. I can point you to some really good resources about GMOs, both people arguing for the use of GMOs and people arguing against them and the science behind all of that. I think that they're really interesting, although I don't personally agree with genetically modified crops and animals. I do think that genetic modification in terms of immunotherapy is really awesome. So, that's just my personal opinion. Everybody's entitled to their own, so you can make up your own opinion about GMOs. Okay. Real quick, let's go through this. A lot of people think that because we live in modern society, we're immune to evolution, specifically natural selection. The truth is that evolution is an ongoing process. Excuse me, in humans as well as every other organism on the planet. In fact, the human population is evolving faster right now, especially on a microevolution scale, just looking at allele frequencies, changing allele frequencies over time, than it has in any time in our past, at least that we know of. And the main contribution to that is migration, gene flow. So humans are moving all over the world, different populations of humans that have been isolated for hundreds to thousands of years have been moving all around the world in the past, let's say 400, 500, 600 years. And they're coming in contact with other populations of humans and interbreeding. And that is changing allele frequencies in populations. And that is microevolution. So just changing those allele frequencies through breeding. And that's all due to migration. So that has rapidly evolved the human population. Although a lot of people think that we're immune to natural selection because we have modern medicine and doctors, and that we tend to live longer and reach reproductive age, we are still susceptible to natural selection. Even though we've curbed natural selection just a little bit, we're still susceptible, and we don't have to look any further than the COVID-19 pandemic right now. There are some individuals that, for whatever reason, whatever gene that's involved, are more immune. They're part of the population that is asymptomatic or has minor symptoms. And that's about 80% of the population, I believe. And then there's the people that are more susceptible. And, whatever genes are involved with that, that is natural selection at work. As sad as it is, and my heart goes out to those people that are really struggling with this disease, with this virus, that is a case of natural selection. Okay, so yeah, just to conclude, evolution is ongoing. Every species, including Earth, right now is going through natural selection. There is this idea that for whatever reason, we have reached the pinnacle of natural selection or of evolution, and that evolution has stopped for every species on the planet. But evolution is ongoing. And one more thing I just remembered, if we go back to artificial selection, natural selection, and GMOs, natural selection, when humans are changing the environment, but we're not directly doing artificial selection, selective breeding for a species, for a domesticated species, that is still natural selection. So let me tell you what I mean. So say that there is a population of black bears, right? Black bears are very adaptable. We are not breeding black bears. No human that I know of is breeding black bears. Maybe outside of a zoo, maybe, or in a zoo, maybe. But nobody's breeding black bears, right? Black bears are highly adaptable, though. They are evolving right now in response to the new environment that humans are creating. And they're doing it in several ways, mostly behaviorally. So they have behavioral adaptations that have underlying genes that they're adapted to, or that they are adapting to this new environment with. So they are adapting by utilizing human waste as a food source, so digging through trash cans and dumpsters and stuff like that. They are evolving the intelligence, and some of this might be learned intelligence, some of this might be instinctual intelligence to break into human structures, whether that's a house or a car or whatever, to get food. They're evolving to be able to cross roads safely. And the problem with that is that you only have one shot at doing that. The human car is going to be the natural selective environmental pressure that acts on that. And if a organism knows to avoid a car, they're going to be more fit than an organism that does not know to avoid a car. So anyway, that is a case of natural selection. I meant to put that in this PowerPoint. It just slipped my mind. Even though we're not directly selectively breeding these black bears or any other species on the planet, we are still altering the environment, and natural selection is therefore selecting for the individuals that are most fit to that new environment, that environment that we have created. So natural selection, artificial selection, and then GMOs. All right. So that concludes this lesson. The good thing about this is that you guys do not have any homework for this. There will be kind of a summative evolution quiz or test at the end of this unit. But first, we're going to go through phylogenetic trees and cladograms. So that's the next lesson. Again, you don't have any classwork, homework, formative assessments for this lesson itself. Hope you all have a great day. Stay healthy, stay safe, and try not to go stir crazy. Don't get cabin fever at home. I'll see you all later. Bye-bye. All right, how do I stop sharing?